Okay, welcome to BrainHealth Office Hours. This is where we take a brain's eye view on a variety of topics of interest to the public. I'm Dan Krawczyk, the Deputy Director at the Center for Brain Health here and also Professor in Behavioral and Brain Science at UT Dallas. And with us today are Julie Fratantoni. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, I'm Dr. Julie Fratantoni. I am one of the research scientists here at the center and get to be involved in our big initiative, the BrainHealth Project.
So Julie and I have expertise in the brain, and our guest today, our guest of honor, is Sarah Schleuning from the Dallas Museum of Art. Sarah's the Margaret Perot Senior Curator there, and she's had an opportunity to share a lot of artist visions and curate really wonderful exhibits. And I was actually able to work with her in a small way on the Speechless exhibit back in 2019. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Let's maybe get rolling with you. If you could say a little about your role as a curator, the kinds of things you do on a day-to-day basis, and what excites you about that.
Well, the job is vast and never boring, which is why I love it. So I specialize in design and decorative arts, and I do everything from commissioning artists to make new pieces, to think about expanding their practice. I see the museum as an incredible place to incubate new ideas, and so we do that. I also work with historic materials and think about, so part of the research and scholarship always leads to an exhibition. A lot of times we develop a collection, but we also, I think for this discussion might be interesting to talk about the role of exhibitions and how you take objects, in my case typically 3D objects, and think about how they work in the space and what is the visitor's perception of those, because the narratives we're creating with the visual sometimes are reinforced by the words we use and the kind of text panels we create, but a lot of times nobody will read those unless they're engaged with the kind of setting and the environment and what are the objects saying. So we talk a lot about that, and even in the works that we bring into the collection or in an exhibition, we think a lot about what presence it has. It's sort of a je ne sais quoi of like wall power, or what kind of will activate people. And with any object, even something like this necklace, I have to think a lot about multiple ways it could be used. Would it be something about its shape, its form, the maker? Is it a story about the way it's rolled, the way it feels, so always you're trying to think, objects speak in multiple narratives, and so you're trying to think how you could use it and how it would activate those ideas. Just small work. I do small work.
So a lot there to think about. I guess from to get us going kind of on the brain side of that equation, it's incredibly deep and rich. And I've often thought one of the real differentiators between humans and other species is we create art and look at it, and we seem to find this activation, as you put it, what activates or what excites an audience, and it's ideas, and it's very tied into language. You mentioned words, but also the concept of 3D objects is exciting. I often think about the brain as like an integrator, and the richest representations will have not just words, right? It's a narrative and imagery, and building memories is so much about integrating not just imagery, but smell or taste or touch, and the more of that you bring into an experience, the more it activates widely across the brain.
Right. Well, I think that's part of the exhibition experience. So one of the challenges with functional objects, which is mostly what I work with, is we don't allow people to use their function typically. So you'll exhibit a chair, but it won't be touchable or sittable, and so you have to think about different ways to animate that for people and activate it. So, and then you're also thinking, you're talking about memory, but memory of visiting things or why objects matter. A lot of times we talk about relivers. Like there's objects we have in the collection that people will remember from something they had in their home or something they enjoyed or coveted, or, all these kinds of things. So you're also activating things in visitors that we can't imagine because we don't actually know. So it's that integration between what we think the story is telling and the experience of how it touches other people. And that's the unquantifiable. But I think one of the things we experiment with exhibitions too is trying to use things like sounds and smells and things to activate, like you say, other senses and engage the mind in other ways. So you're not just in a, you know, sort of like passive enjoyment, but actually active participation in certain ways, or engagement, I guess is a better word.
You touch on this idea of narratives or kind of having an understanding when you're experiencing an exhibition or looking at art. What are some, I guess, you mentioned, you know, a lot of people don't read kind of what's there, and so what are some other ways that you engage people or get them to?
Well, we always hope they read because we try and create really compelling stories, but I think every exhibition or every time you show something, you have to, you can't understand who the visitor is. You have to imagine they come in at different levels. And what your hope is to excite curiosity and to encourage people to dig deeper into understanding. So you might say, oh, okay, we'll stay with the necklace. That's a pretty necklace, great, and I'm done. And then other people might say, I want to understand who makes that or how it's made. And maybe the show is about that, so there might be more labels about that, but I'm always hoping people walk away wanting to learn more. I mean, this is why we all end up in this trajectory of our own passions, why people get excited about things is you've been inspired to wonder more. So I never want to do an exhibition that is a fully encapsulated, closed project. You always want to encourage people, and we're always experimenting with things like animation. So we just did a big exhibition about Cartier and Islamic art, and we used a lot of animation to unpackage how jewelry was made, where some of the source ideas came from, and used that through video animation so that, and it was also embedded in text as well, but maybe some people weren't going to read those or read the catalog, but if you were engaged enough, you could. The information was there, but it's about how people sort of process. And you know, video, you can tell a really rich story sometimes in 30 seconds that takes me maybe 10 paragraphs to write.
Picture's worth 1,000 words, for sure. So that's actually something I was curious about. It's almost like your role has a top-down component as well as a bottom-up. The top-down being you're trying to convey some sense of history or some theme, yet there's this sort of bottom-up aspect that the audience is, or the viewer is or the experiencer is going to bring something of their own to it and be engaged so that their experience may be different. And I think it has a lot of similarity to teaching. You know, we often don't want to just implant an idea in someone's head. We want them to engage with it, and multiple modalities like animation or sensory experience seem quite critical to that.
Yeah, I mean, I try never to do an exhibition that feels top-down, like I'm telling you what you should be seeing. Those bother me personally. When I go into an exhibition, I feel like I needed to read 14 paragraphs before I got it, because it is supposed to be, art is also about what you see in it. Like there really is, theoretically, there's no kind of wrong way to see it. It's what you see in it, what you take away, and then what we try and share is maybe the artist's intent, or how this might be in a narrative about women designers at this time period. And so you're trying to come kind of at the side. I would say, like, instead of the top and bottom, I'd say you're trying to come in and create, here's a possible narrative, here's information, here's stories and history and knowledge, but there are ways to experience things that are just because you enjoy them, or because a chair may be really great to you because it's really comfortable, or it's because it's what your grandmother was in. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the memories that we have and the journeys that you sort of progress on, and if you start to unpackage those backwards as you age, you start to think, I was thinking about like the color celadon, and I finally was like realizing that one of the reasons I loved it so much was because it was my grandmother's favorite color, and all her clothes were those shades.
What is that? shade.
Celadon is like a gray-green. It's like often found in ceramics, Korean ceramics. Sorry, I'm such a art historian.
I love it.
But I was starting to realize it was a mental memory that was actually more of a physical memory that had implanted into sort of why I really have this positive attachment to this color. And I think I love talking to people who talk about museums as like safe spaces, who remember going there as kids, and sometimes what they remember about the museum may be the architecture. They may remember the glass elevator or the round atrium, or they may remember a sculpture or something, but it doesn't really matter. It's that you then attach to that idea. And I think that's really exciting when you realize that a lot of us move in these paths because things, have become sort of like bellwether moments, right? Like, I don't know, I'm talking.
That's an amazing sort of perspective, because you're really designing this sort of all ages, aren't you? Because in children, you might actually be having an oversized impact because they'll have a nostalgic connection to what they saw at that young age.
And then in other people, you're tapping nostalgia of the past, right? And that's what you don't know when you're creating something, is you don't know how it will connect with people. And one of the things in designing an exhibition and putting it in is that you, especially with 3D, you never know what it's going to be like in the space until you physically start working on it. And so a lot of times what looks great on paper, right? It's like an essay, right? You think this is going to be such an amazing conclusion, and then you're like, just really didn't deliver. And so you have to work in real time trying to figure out, because what happens is in a book or when you're laying something out, something very small and something very big you can kind of make look okay, or something in the round versus flat will be okay, but you put them in a room together and all of a sudden one takes a dominance that's unintentional, and then you have to start thinking through, how do I help the visitor when they experience this? How do I draw someone into a room? How do I make the piece that makes you want to walk across the room to engage in the show? How do I animate this case so you want to learn about it and you want to read the label? Because all that knowledge we have that we put in there, you're not going to read unless you're excited about what you're seeing. So one sense has to trigger another, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, part of what I'm always trying to think about, and I think about it very much where the visual is first and the writing, I don't know, I can't think of what would be the reading. The verbal is secondary. And I think that historically, we tend to prioritize the verbal because we are always writing about the object and we want people to understand the knowledge that we're sharing. But I just, for my work more and more, I'm like, the visual is so important. Now, there's sound pieces, there's other pieces that don't, but the artwork needs to be the driver for people to want to learn more.
What you're talking about is just cultivating curiosity. And curiosity is like the learning glue of the brain, right? It gives you this nice kind of chemical cocktail. You've got just different neurotransmitters working in a way that are exciting, and then you actually are able to encode that information in a way. So you talk about creating memories and truly just the heart of learning. But there's so many different ways to evoke curiosity and kind of how you do that. And so I love thinking about, curation as really it's getting people excited, and that's so, I hadn't thought about it that way before. So.
It's fun in a museum. And I think people should be engaged. And again, one of the things, I love to go to museums, for example, with people who I don't have shared interests with, friends, but because they'll take me to shows I will not naturally go to. It's like a book club, right? All of a sudden you're like, it's not really something I thought I wanted to see. I'm not really interested in photography typically. And then there's connections that are made to things I'm really interested in that I just didn't know. And I think anytime you push yourself to expose yourself to something else, you always end up learning something.
It's highly stimulating. A couple of really strong things kind of are reverberating in my mind now about Gestalt psychology, so that the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. In some ways, that's what you were describing. You have to try to have the Gestalt in mind, because the parts alone don't quite do it justice, not like the full experience, and that must be really challenging to keep that big sort of picture in mind, especially for how other people may see it. And the other thing that you've mentioned a couple of times is like the form of objects or sort of fixed objects, and I think of creativity. So, you know, one of the hallmarks of human reasoning is that we have this ability to take numerous objects and turn them into tools or turn them into adornment or decoration in really flexible, novel ways. And often in other species, we look for that same kind of creativity, and we're amazed when they can use sticks in a way that lets them use it as a tool to usually to get food. But there's something very deep there about how an object can kind of shape our experience and how we see its function, and that's very flexible.
Yeah, I think, and sometimes it's very hard to express function if it's not an object that's natural to you, and that's one of the challenges we have often with more historical objects, because people don't think about like the angel food cake slicer made just as an object look really wild and sort of atypical, because we don't use a range of cutlery anymore that is specified for certain objects and certain things. And so I think, even our own past things look novel, and we have to explain. I mean, take a rotary phone to a 14-year-old today and they have no idea what it is. They wouldn't even really know how to use it, right?
That's absolutely correct.
I mean, so I have to write or make a video or do a diagram or something that explains how that object would be used. And then, sometimes, right, then you can't even then express the heft. Remember the heft of the receiver? And then the slowness of dialing, and what happened if you would forget dial the wrong one and you'd have to start over, and just that sound. I know when we used to show at another museum, we used to play the sound for people, because that's such a visceral, like the sound of a dial-up modem, like evokes for some of us who remember that very strong feelings and impatience, typically for me. But I think these are all elements we're already forgetting faster than we can imagine, and then you take that out of your own culture, and it's even more novel. So there's a lot of that that's really challenging. But I was thinking about the first thing you said, and one of the challenges with an exhibition, I also think too, and is that, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this, but I feel like people only kind of walk away with 3 things. 3 is sort of like my magic number. And so you may have this massive idea and all these elements you're trying to bring and explain and unpackage. You don't know what pieces people are going to take away, but I'm always trying to figure out how to distill it, because I just don't know how much people can take away. And so if you give them too much, they short circuit. But if you don't give enough, they're not engaged. So it's that balance of like...
It's mind reading, isn't it? It's very much theory in mind, right? What is someone going to, how do you get the major point across?
Especially when they're coming in at all different levels and different ages, it's a challenge.
Yeah, because I feel like I'm always trying to cut back a little bit, but then you don't want to cut so back it becomes too, there's not a complexity to it, because then you short circuit curiosity.
I think that's an art in and of itself, of just knowing how much information to give that's not too much or too little.
But I also think of working memory limits. So we have usually somewhere between 4 to 6, 4 or 5 items that we can really hold in mind at a time. So you've got to deal with human information processing limits as well. That we're not going to have 12 takeaways, right? Or unless we stay there half the day and we've really thought through all this at an incredibly deep level. But we kind of communicate in these briefer, sort of overview-ish. What's the take-home message?
I was thinking about this the other day. I was in a bookstore, and I was thinking about book covers, because I'm working on a book. And you're like, wow, so many of them look the same. And what is something that excites you? And the ones, like for me, that were so exciting wasn't color, which is typically red and yellow are the colors, right, that you get drawn to. At least that's a graphic design theory. And but it's tactileness. And I got really obsessed with ones that looked like they felt different. And I thought that was so interesting because it was taking it out of the visual, but it was what was drawing to me to what I presumed to have.
Right, and the
Physicality.
Speechless book by Laurie Haycock-Mackellar, I
Yeah.
believe, had a felt cover, which is really incredibly memorable. And just, even though it was visually sparse, the sort of velvety maroon cover, it's just unmistakable.
Yeah, we designed that with it was almost like a flocked cover, and then the type we made smaller because we wanted you to come closer to it and feel like you wanted to hold it, and that was part of the idea behind the cover.
So what cover design ideas do you have in mind for this one? If I can ask, or is it too early?
This is part of the rabbit hole that you go down, is every aspect of the project you're trying to think through. So you're thinking about what do you want the book cover or the title design of the show to evoke for people? What would already start to lead into the idea of what they're going, how are you building that? Are you, and what juxtaposes, so I'm working on a project about contemporary jewelry, which is very sort of breaks the kind of tradition of jewelry. So do you want a cover that breaks tradition, or do you want one that's a little more refined so that the object stands out? Do you use typography to make that? Do you use texture? These are all just really fun questions of the kind of sort of curating what would grab people, but that's why I went in to experience a bookstore and look at all these art books and trying to think about how do you stand out among them, or what are you trying to say about them? Because in some cases, you're the same scale. You've got to get your title out there. You've got to have it be legible, theoretically. And so then how do you work within those parameters to make something that's distinct so that when you look at it, you're like, I'm curious about this. I haven't figured out the answer yet. And you have to collaborate with a lot of people. It can never be I'm trying to create a brief of things that I want or things that I think would be interesting. But that's where you collaborate with other artists and other people, because they always bring different ideas to the mix. And if you're open to it, it elevates the project exponentially.
But this might be a good time to involve some audience questions. If you have anything you've been wanting to ask or add to the discussion in some way, just go ahead and let us know.
This is really a question to Julie and Dan, so you're off the hook there for a moment. But I'd love to have you both talk about, you've heard these wonderful descriptions about how curation happens in the museum, the selection of objects, the refinement of the ideas, the inclusiveness of audiences. But can you talk about how the brain works when in going through this visual processing system?
Julie, you should take this one.
So your brain is taking in all sorts of information all the time, right? You're processing thousands of bits of color and light, and all of your senses are involved. And I think, so as you experience something like this, and there's going to be you come in with your own kind of history of your life, and so you kind of apply that, and then you have your own sort of filter in which you're going to experience things through. That's kind of what Sarah was speaking to. You don't know what people are coming in with.
Right.
And so through that, it really depends. I'll speak more to kind of the processing of it, what we would call integrated reasoning, right, of taking lots of different pieces of information and how do you kind of put them together and boil that down into a takeaway or into something that's memorable. And what's cool about that is that looks different for everybody, right, of what, but that process, that's a really important frontal lobe executive function skill of being able to take in at a high level, to drill down into what are the key details of, okay, the colors and the shapes and where they're placed in relation to where I am and what that makes me think of. And then what is a bigger theme here that's being communicated, either that I'm just sensing or that was an artist's intent. And then how do I combine those things, kind of having those critical details, the bigger view, and being able to sort of, yeah, boil that down into what's a meaningful nugget that I will remember or that I can apply and do something with. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's part of what's so fun about this is that you don't know what is either, what they're going to come with that we each individually can add to that. And I think other systems that you could think about, like I think about, your central executive networks, that's when you're focused, you're reading, you're very intentionally engaging your attention with what's around you. But then you also need your default mode network to come into play where that's going to kind of mix those ideas up and connect them with existing ideas that you already have had, and then come up with something maybe even novel from that wasn't presented to you. So, I mean, there's so many things from just integrating from a sensory perspective to integrating from kind of an intellectual or knowledge perspective, tying in what you've already known. I don't know, Dan, what would you add?
I think that's really well put. The integrating is certainly part of it. When you think of the visual system, it's a lot of integrating edges with, color and shape, and assembling all of that seems to be the role of the visual cortex, the early visual cortex at the back of the brain. But what Julie talked about just now, focusing, the other amazing component of our visual system is expectation drives so much of the search. It's a very dynamic process. We're not simply just receiving an input bottom up. And I used that term earlier.
Right.
Bottom up is kind of like you have no expectations. Just come on, world, show me what you got. But what we really do so often is we impose sort of an expected image and visual search, and I think that's very relevant to Sarah's role, because often we categorize it as a chair or as a phone, seeing it, and then we move on. So what you're talking about is how do you stoke someone's curiosity about this? Maybe it's not a phone. Maybe it's it has another use, and that sort of dynamic bottom up versus top down expectation. I mean, that's the crux of this whole thing. It's not just integrating, it's kind of inspiring to go beyond maybe just the categorization component and seek other inputs or seek other meaning maybe internally from memory.
I would also add, we haven't really talked about emotion much, but that is a huge piece to experiencing things, and something that you also bring to the table that kind of helps shape that lens or that filter that you are going to experience things through. So, we talk about, this, I don't know if you consider gratitude an emotion, but that when you're in a certain state, that your medial prefrontal cortex is going to kind of set that lens of how you're going to then intake all that information. And memory also, or without kind of, well, you're all going to come in with some sort of baseline emotion, but in engaging with that or having a nostalgic memory, whether that's sadness or happiness or whatever that may be, that emotion then also can make those memories, make them even stronger, because that kind of, the way that those things interplay. But emotion, I think, is really fascinating when you think about, how we then are able to consolidate information, because sometimes I feel like it can almost get in the way sometimes of being able to actually take in all the information that's there, because your frontal lobe isn't as active. So,
Can I ask a question? Because I'm curious about this, one of the big moves right now in exhibitions is more of these immersive experiences versus kind of going in and just viewing paintings and sort of, right? So I'm just curious what you guys would think about what are sort of the, let's say, pros and cons of each type, a very like you're going in and you're, everything's activated, sound, smell, you're enveloped versus looking in and what, because it's something we're dealing with a lot in the field about almost oversaturation versus that.
gosh, I mean, coming out of a COVID world where everything was virtual for so long, I feel like maybe it's just a bit of an overcorrection to desire like lots of experience and in person. But okay, your original question is just kind of the
well,
pros
there's
and
two
cons.
different kinds of exhibitions, right? Where one is you're just sort of looking at something and you're really taking that in that way. You get all that emotion. I mean, you're looking at a Monet, right? And you're just sort of exploring that. versus an experience where maybe sounds are playing and it's projected behind you and you're feeling, maybe there's mist or there's something that makes you, so it's trying to put you in the painting, say, for example.
Wow, yeah, I think of like there's many tools that could be leveraged, and it's finding the right match for the purpose. So I'm thinking of museums, like natural history museums have gone the same direction, where there's a lot of really immersive sorts of exhibits, and one that occurs to me is one on the human body, which had a lot of huge intestines and organs, and they even had smells, and they had lots of visual and verbal labels, and the positive of that was it really gave you some, sense of being small and like going actually in the body and kind of like learning about these systems. It was very effective, and I have a strong memory of that. But by the same, sort of to represent the counterpoint though, another exhibit which was really impactful to me is the Field Museum in Chicago, which is very historical. It has that huge Grand Central Station kind of lobby, and Sue the Tyrannosaur is on display. And what I think is so wonderful is Sue is just presented as in skeletal form, and they have a beautiful painting of a Tyrannosaur done in the style of Robert Knight, who did all the early paintings historically from dinosaurs. I'm a dinosaur person, as you can tell. That goes back deeply into my childhood. And so I really appreciated the simplicity of how Sue is presented. It doesn't have roars, it doesn't have animatronics. It's kind of elegant in a way that allows the viewer to kind of experience the grandeur, right, of that Gestalt kind of phenomenon. So I think there could be a lot of value in both styles, but it does seem the modern way is to put more sensory inputs in.
But it's interesting your example, because the painting and the skeleton actually forced you to create your own imagination of where you combine those, right? You probably in your own mind created the roars and that right? You
and it tapped into all the memories and emotion that Julie talked about earlier, right? It takes me back to my childhood. This is one of the iconic sort of, creatures of that time, and they're really, you don't want to overwhelm someone. And I suppose it goes to your historical objects idea as well. You don't want to present them too jarringly, because it doesn't really match what the brain is going to expect or get out of the experience.
I think also there's an element of you could be the same person, or two different people could go through the same thing. Like you could experience anything passively. Like you could walk through, even if it was a very immersive experience, you could very passively kind of just go through it and not glean a lot. I think there's ways, like just because it's immersive doesn't necessarily guarantee. I think it gives you an experience. I don't know that it guarantees that it evokes kind of new ideas or their own understanding of it. I think it takes the person, we talk about this all the time, this is with any information, not just with art or an exhibition, but reading a newspaper or watching a movie or whatever it may be. How many books have you read that you're like, yeah, I read it, but I don't remember what it was about, or a movie that you've seen, right? And so it takes kind of that extra mental effort to then do that consolidation that I was talking about. And so I guess I'm just thinking it doesn't matter as much, and right, for different purposes, depending on what you're trying to communicate, are appropriate for the different styles that you display things, but it's really what they do kind of during, but really after, of taking that moment to actually sort of reflect on it or talk about it or have some type of giving them the chance to do that, because I think without that, then it kind of just goes away, and it was like just something you did.
What are some other ideas that you want to bring up?
So I'm kind of curious about the concept of maybe emergent behavior, especially as you move into maybe more sensory exposure in these exhibits and things like that. Have you, in your experience that you've curated these exhibits, seen emergent behavior from audiences based on new information you're showing them in new ways? I guess an example would be in art school, some friends would go to the DMA and they'd bring a sketchbook and they would sit there and just draw based on those portraits and things like that, which isn't necessarily what I think those exhibits are designed for, but it's kind of an emergent behavior based on them kind of coming to the space with their own desire or purpose. And so I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts or insight on that.
Well, we actually do love when people come draw, and we encourage that, and I love that. So I think I think there's a mindset for people that there's only one way to behave in a museum, which is absolutely incorrect. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles we deal with, is to tell people there are many ways. Now, we don't often encourage touching, but sometimes we do, and we, with this show we've referenced with Speechless, we actually did encourage touching, and it was a challenge, I think, even within the institution to allow people to do that, because it was a different behavior. And then it's very hard, especially when you switch it from gallery to gallery. But I think certainly that, drawing, I'm trying to think of other kind of emergent. I love when I see, particularly kids, because they're less concerned about what other people think, but I see people, sometimes twirling, it makes the guards crazy, but pictures of dance, or sometimes things like Jackson Pollock's or others that have expressed massive movement. Often you see people move with them. It sort of creates that similar kind of experience, or you see people out with the sculptures or other things trying to mimic or match that behavior with their body. So I think there's sort of incredible things like that are involuntary. I think the wish is always to make people feel more capable of, that there's a higher capacity and appreciation for that than it feels like. And that's, I think, one of the challenges we struggle with in museums, is just balancing the sort of stewardship for the art with the visitor engagement and experience. And so that's an ongoing challenge, and I think the more we push shows and acknowledge and really welcome more neurodiverse audiences, the more we have to be willing to accept some of the differences that will happen in these spaces, and that, maybe even things like quiet, there are just certain moments that are quiet hours, because some people really like to see art in this very quiet, independent sort of way. This is the difference sort of between what I was saying about immersive and not. Some people want to just stand and really become one with the piece. Other people want to talk about it. They want to be listening to a soundtrack. They want to be engaging other things. And so that also creates other things, but it may disturb someone else. And I think about, I was talking to one of our gallery attendants once, and she was telling me how somebody came into the Speechless gallery and was asking, how do I go through, tell me about this piece. So she told them this great story. It was a really positive interaction. The next visitor comes in and she does the same thing, and the person's like, you're really bothering me. I don't want to be told. You've ruined the experience for me because you've told me what's going to happen. This is and she was crushed. And I was like, this is the challenge of, you don't actually also know how people want to engage with stuff. And a lot of times people don't know until they're in their space, because different artwork inspires different kinds of engagement for us as individuals, because we're not monoliths ourselves. The visitors aren't monoliths. And so it's really it's a real challenge, because the experienced art is very personal, I feel like. And I think that's, as a curator and as a museum professional, you're just trying to open up this idea, and we just want more people coming in to be part of it. And that the quantifiable is this ripple, there's this ripple effect. I love talking to people who will say, there's an artist we just did a piece with who went to Booker, and he was talking about shows he saw when he was 16 and how they affected the work he did 20 years later. That's not an evaluation. That's that's just about what it means to be in the thing. And I think those are really exciting moments. But he probably would have walked out of that show as a 16-year-old and net told you it totally meant something different than what it did as a 40-year-old. I didn't really answer my question.
I'm prompted.
I
So
got
I
excited.
have a follow up. So I'm prompted to ask, is there an example of a time you had set something up in a way that you kind of predicted it would result in certain behavior and it totally didn't, and people really surprised you? Has that happened?
I feel like it happens all the time. Absolutely. Yeah, because you can't, and so I did a series of outdoor playscapes, and we would make these interactive pieces with designers that were these very engaging pieces, and we would spend a long time talking about how we thought kids and adults would use them and how to make them safe, and like trying to like deal with all those issues and still engage. And I remember we put this one piece up and we were so excited. We're like, that's great, it's perfect, because there was cement underneath it. And it opened and this group of kids came running out on the piazza and they immediately grabbed these things and hung upside down with their heads like this far from the cement. And we were like, how did we miss that one? Like, I don't understand. But I think people, especially interactives, people, and that's what, for me, they're the greatest challenge and the most exciting place I want to push my own kind of work, and I want to push museums more to do, because it's one thing to sit there and try and imagine how things work or how they feel, and it's, you know, it's great if you put something next to it and you kind of get it. It's totally different to feel the thing or be in it and to try and understand how that's made. And it's not better or worse than anything. I just think it engages people in a different way. And I just really get excited when people move these pieces and objects become platforms for other ideas. And I think that's that idea of emergent, right? It's like a sculpture is made, and when somebody's trying to mimic it with their body, they're creating their own work themselves. It's both responsive, but that becomes a catalyst for more ideas. And that's what you're always hoping comes out.
Just another, kind of just not really a question, but it almost feels like gallery spaces have maybe some of the same troubles we have at the center to some degree, with like how you mentioned like the chairs being like functional pieces that people, they understand, but you're not really interacting with it. It's kind of like how they treat the brain almost to some degree, like that's the brain. It processes information, I move along. I see the chair, that's the chair, it sits things, I move along. And so I guess it's interesting that in this gallery space you're trying to cultivate curiosity, but for the brain you're trying to do the same thing, where you're trying to get people interested in like interacting and engaging with that. So I think it's an interesting parallel between the two. So.
Well, and even like I think about like as a kid, my parents used to try and get me engaged to stay in a museum, and I remember being at the Hirshhorn and my dad making us guess what every sculpture was made of, and then we would run up and see it, and it was, again, didn't matter who made it, didn't really matter what it was, but it was forcing us to look at a different aspect of it. And I think that's part of, like, it's like part of what you're trying to do is say, forget that this is about art and we're in a museum, let's think about this idea, or let's break this down to materiality, or, you know, so that you find that different way to engage in it.
I think of like at the Tate Modern in London, this friend of ours was going through it with us, and there was a projection on the wall. And he put his hand in front of it and blocked it, and he said, "This is how temporary art can be." You know, and my wife actually accidentally sat on a chair that was art. And you know, those moments just, it was ridiculous that happened, but they really stick with me. Like, it kind of added some joy to it, like something unexpected was done, right? And it's sort of, that's where the magic can be in some cases.
I mean, art to me is totally alchemy. I mean, just that whole idea that you take a piece of paper and a pencil and it somehow becomes a Rodin sketch. You know, different people in different ways manifest it. And I was telling my daughter, she was making some art, and it was, I would say, not what you'd call sort of a traditional 13-year-old like piece that would be glorified. And I was like, don't worry about it. I was like, it's about experimenting, and you have to find your own voice. No one can make what you make. And you have to get out of that your own thing. And I think that's what happens in museums, right? That people put that own thing. I understand this is important because I have a mouse pad that is this artist. So it must be important. Or like labels are a huge thing, right? I'm always freaking out because it's like the longest label in the room, most people will assume is the most important piece in the show. because I wrote the most about it. And I'm like, but in fact, it probably wasn't, or even if it is, if you enjoy something else and that makes you curious, that's totally great. And so you're trying to break some of those things down so that people aren't putting preconceived notions. I mean, I have a lot of people who like to only go to museums with me because they feel like you could be the guide for me. I'm not gonna understand something, and I'm thinking, like I always try and tell people pieces I don't like, so that people feel it's okay to not like pieces. I feel like you should like always the brain. Just want to go back to that, like the brain is very important. But I think it's interesting how we kind of censor ourselves, and museums are places like that, which is different than like libraries, right? I always, in my mind, they're very similar, but libraries feel like sort of non-judgmental, where somehow there's a weird
Yeah,
aspect.
it makes me think about kind of some different biases or even framing, and I feel like Dan, you could speak to that all day.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, well, so context is enormously important, and your job is, in a sense, you're a context specialist, right? You're trying to, and connecting it to behavior. So classically, the framing effect from psychology has always been people will act quite differently if they're under threat. So any sort of risk, you frame something as you're going to lose this money if you don't, you know, and I'm going to give you an offer and you can try to keep it, or you're definitely going to lose it. People always gamble more in those cases because they want to avoid the loss. And I think it has a powerful emotional framing, right? So evoking an emotion has a consequence as to how people see it and how they behave toward it. And I would just want to follow up on, you mentioned something about disliking, you know, showing people things you dislike. I love disliking art, especially modern art. And one of the most enjoyable parts of modern art galleries is to sort of talk about what you dislike. And you realize, wow, this is actually very effective art because it's created this whole experience of saying and reacting to it, right? Whether it's positive or negative. And you just kind of come away with, I like it because I disliked it so much and it had such an effect on me.
Well, right, evoking any response means something happened, right? But I think, I always tell people, it's like, you don't have to like everything, but you should appreciate why some aspect of it, like that, how it was made, or like, I was trying to pull that through for people about why it's in a museum, why there's things about it that make it interesting, but they don't have to be interesting to you. So that's it.
Any other burning questions people have on this topic? Okay, I really framed that one as a fail. Any just curiosity?
Yeah, it's definitely more of a curiosity than a burning question. You talked a lot about how individuals react differently to different art, you know, how we look at art as an individual thing. But is there any evidence or research to know why a person reacts or engages with a certain type of art might be an indicator to their neurological diversity on some level?
Well, I don't know as a specific answer. I feel like there is, and if there isn't, there should be. Bonnie's desperate to say something.
Well,
No, you say.
there's a whole field of neuroaesthetics that really looks at the integrated, the brain function as well as the aesthetic function. And so talking to you, I'm sorry my back is towards you, but the main idea is that we know for a fact that nobody sees the same way because we know what the function of the eye is and that the rods and cones vary tremendously and the sensitivity and all the different ways. And though the eye, once all of those pulses are sent through to the visual cortex through the optic nerve, then the deciphering begins. And so the issue about abstract art versus figurative art versus objects begins to break out. And the reality is most of the findings are that people who don't like contemporary art don't like it because they don't understand it. It looks too simple. It doesn't make sense, like the painting behind you. I could do it myself. That is a response of a person who doesn't have the knowledge to go with the work of art. Whereas an intricate necklace or the glass piece, they may not understand that abstract glass piece, but they understand glass. And so what really happens is bits and pieces of information come together, and also, very, very importantly, the context of how that person grew up. So a child or a young adult growing up in a home that's filled with abstract art responds very differently than a person who grew up in a house that had art like my grandmother did, which was all foofy and pink and green and celadon and, standard portraits of everybody. And, and then there are homes that have nothing. And so the bridge we have to make is huge, but there is a lot of study around this. It's not, what I'm trying to do now is bring the study of neuroaesthetics and brain science into the world of art museums, because the truth is the average person stands in front of a work of art less than 16 seconds. So our job is to slow them down, get a sense of awe, and get them to really look and develop a life-changing moment. And Sarah and I know that happens. The question is, how can we make it even more effective by using brain science as we move forward?
Can you break the 16-second barrier?
Yeah, can we break the 16 second, 16 to 20 seconds. That's if they're looking. That's not a lot of time to catch a person, and a lot of that when you set up an exhibition is you need to be looking at not only that object but two objects beside it to get the new context. So that slowing down and reframing things is what I'm hoping that we're going to be working on in the next stage of the research that we do here, because it will be immensely important to planning and curation going forward.
Well, since we're thinking of time, let's go ahead and move toward wrapping up. Before we finish, though, I do want to mention, with regard to the research, there has been more research that I know of in neurological contexts with patients who are having either dementia or a brain injury, and the production of their art can be examined.
Right.
And this is like Mario Mendez and Bruce Miller have done some great work reporting on profound changes that are observed with either psychiatric or neurological conditions in people's production of art. So I think it's not just a reception, it's not just a commentary on how you receive it, but what ideas you express can also change. I think we have one more burning question here.
This is kind of a burning comment because my area of interest is art therapy. So it is all about the process. And being a sculpture artist myself, I always love to show the process, because a lot of people have no idea how a live cast is created or all of the different materials that go into making something like that. And so being in a gallery, it's usually not common to see the process paired with the final piece. And that's something that recently I've been thinking a lot about, because sometimes the materials themselves are very interesting. And for art therapy, the process is the therapy. And so kind of to piggyback off of what you were saying, kind of breaking that down for people so that they can maybe try to understand where this piece came from or how it was made could help them to perceive it in a way that either, is from an understanding or just, to be more curious about it because they've seen the materials, the baseline materials.
So what's interesting about what you're saying is there's two different ideas. So a lot of the work and the exhibitions I've done actually are very much about the process, because I'm very interested in kind of from inspiration to final, but inspiration and ideas aren't always about materiality and about the actual physicality of making it. So, sometimes it's about where these ideas come and how they do that, these sketches and these processes and all these things, and right, there's a lot of stuff about some people process ideas by, like in fashion, you say you're a draper or a drawer, right? There's two different kind of ways you make something. And I think that I'm really curious about that myself, and I'm always trying to do it. The problem is you can't kind of do it over and over for every object, because again, it's too much for people. But I think lifting that curtain and kind of showing people how ideas, and it's individual for each maker as well, how these things, I mean, certain casts are, you're right, there's certain universalities of some things, but on the others, it really shifts. And it's hard too, because as many people are really fascinated in that, for other people it's too much. Like I don't care that that broke the mold and the slip casting and that happened in the glazing process, and sometimes you can't only do that in words, you gotta, and so like I'm always trying to figure out how do you do that with visuals or with something else that can be faster or in a different way, because if you try and keep people for 5 minutes there, sometimes they just tap out. But it is a really thing. It's also much easier, for me it's much easier with functional objects, because there is something, and what was said earlier was really interesting to me, because one of the things, because I deal with design, one of the things I'm always trying to deal with is, it's a double-edged sword, that on one hand it's like the gateway into the art world, because people can understand sneakers, they can understand cars, or chairs or whatever, but on the other hand...
Rotary phones.
Rotary phones, thank you. Nice callback. But I think on the other hand, it's hard for people to see that as like art. So that you're balancing that like, oh, I get it, but I'm always trying to talk about people about how you curate sort of your own life. Like you make choices. Like when you buy an automobile, or don't, you've made a choice. You're talking about what color you want. What status does it mean to you? Are you environmental because you're electric? Do you want to be seen as someone cutting edge? Are you a blue blazer or a checked one? You know, what are the kind of things you're doing? All those are decisions you're making that are the same kinds of things designers and artists are making. What kind of material? What's my form? What's my shape? And so I think I like to talk to people in those ways, because we all do that individually. We edit out things and we make decisions about how you want to be seen, how you see yourself. Those are all really, like, if you think about what do you have in your private spaces that nobody goes into, very few, what do you have in your public spaces? Often those are two different kind of existences, and that's a lot about the objects you keep around you. Right, and I think those are really interesting ideas, and those are also like materiality. They're things that you start to think about. Oh, you're right. Like I like when people come to my living room to see all my art books, because I want for people to know that I read art books. But all my mysteries are in the back where I'm like, because I don't want people to know that I read all these like weird Swedish dark books that make me very depressed. But I think it's interesting, right? It's like what makes me happy versus how I want to be seen, signified. So
It's all about framing, yeah. Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Julie, what are your final thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think it just, it reinstills the sense of awe at our prefrontal cortex as part of the brain that makes us different from animals, that we can imagine things, we can create things, we can interpret and experience things, and every single brain is different. And so I think it's just fun to think about the different ways that, different things make us curious, and then we do different things with that information. So it was just really fun to think about how you provoke that, evoke that, and it's fun.
Sarah, anything else we didn't cover that you want to conclude with?
I think for me what's really exciting is I just wish these fields were more interconnected, because I think we don't all exist in the, like all the work I do and things do is so interrelates, and this is so, makes just me more curious. I was already like, I want to learn about this neuroaesthetics more, and things like that. Like I think we always act like these things are separate, and in fact they're deeply connected.
Agreed. Interdisciplinary convergence is always exciting, much like art. And one of my concluding thoughts: the brain is about action. You know, and as a viewer in a gallery, there's something passive there, which I think we need to get beyond. And you talked about kind of that expected behavior. What really is exciting is when you want to act, you want to talk about it, it inspires you to maybe create something. And maybe that's one way to measure the effect of art, is actually how much the brain becomes engaged, not just the visual cortex, right? You want to have like your emotional regions, you want to have some kind of nostalgia and memory, and that's what makes it really impactful. But it doesn't mean as much as when we go out and actually do something with it. So thanks so much, Sarah, and all of you, and we'll talk again soon.